Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're cracking open the book Mandate for Leadership, the conservative promise to explore, you guessed it, the FCC.
The Federal Communications Commission.
Exactly, and what a new administration might focus on in 2025 big tech.
TikTok.
Oh yeah, definitely TikTok competition in the telecom world. A lot to unpack, so let's dive right in.
You know, one thing that really stood out to me in this chapter is how they explain the why behind these proposals. Like, it's
Yeah.
not just do this, but they lay out the reasoning, which is really important if you want to grasp those potential ripple effects, you know?
Makes sense. So before we get too far ahead of ourselves, can we just start with the basics? Like, what exactly is the FCC? What kind of authority do they actually wield?
Well, the FCC is what we call an independent agency.
Meaning?
It means they're not directly under the president or Congress. They kind of do their own thing. They're like the referees for all interstate and international communications.
So we're talking,
Radio, TV, wire, satellite, cable, the whole 9 yards.
wow, that's a lot.
Yeah.
And they have the power to,
Oh, yeah. They can set rules, enforce those rules, and even make money for the U.S. Treasury.
wait, the FCC makes money.
They sure do, by auctioning off spectrum.
So they're not your typical government agency.
Not at all.
Right. It's them calling the shots on everything from net neutrality to those mega mergers we see all the time.
Absolutely.
And then there's this thing called the Universal Service Fund. Always seemed kind of mysterious to me. What is that all about?
Yeah, so the Universal Service Fund, or USF, is a huge program. It basically subsidizes affordable internet access,
Like for who?
especially in rural areas and for folks with lower incomes,
Makes sense. It
Yes,
was
so-
funded.
through fees that are added to our phone bills.
Oh, interesting. So is that like a tax?
Kind of. But here's the thing. The book points out that maybe, just maybe, this whole funding model needs an update, in the age of streaming and broadband.
Makes you think, huh?
Uh,
You mentioned that this chapter lays out some key goals for a new administration taking over in 2025. What are those exactly?
well, the authors focus on four main things: reining in big tech, strengthening national security, promoting economic prosperity, which might sound kind of contradictory to the first two, right?
Yeah, a little bit.
And lastly, making sure the FCC itself is accountable and, well, running smoothly.
Okay, I like it.
Yeah.
Let's dig into that first one, big tech. What exactly are they concerned about?
Well, the authors argue that these companies have gotten way too powerful,
Hmm.
and they need some accountability. There are worries about censorship
Censorship, like what kind?
of certain viewpoints, especially conservative ones, and a lack of transparency in how these big tech companies are making decisions that affect, well, everyone.
Okay, so what's the solution? Break them up, regulate them like utilities.
One of the things they suggest is taking another look at Section 230.
Section 230, remind me what that is.
Basically, it protects online platforms from lawsuits over what users post.
So like YouTube isn't responsible for every video that gets uploaded.
That's the gist, yeah. But the book proposes clarifying what it actually covers and maybe even getting rid of some of the broad immunities that courts have kind of tacked onto it over the years.
Okay. But wouldn't that make platforms even more likely to censor things? I mean, just to avoid lawsuits.
That's a very valid point, and it's one of the main arguments against changing Section 230.
What do they say?
Well, they say it would stifle innovation and actually lead to more censorship.
Not less.
Right, not less. They argue that these legal protections are essential for platforms to function properly.
I see, so it's a complicated issue. Anything else the authors bring up when it comes to big tech?
Yeah, they propose making big tech companies chip into the Universal Service Fund.
Because,
They rely so heavily on the internet infrastructure it supports,
yeah, that makes sense. But is there a counter-argument?
Some folks argue that instead of just piling on big tech, we should maybe rethink the entire funding structure of the USF.
So like what? Get rid of the phone bill fees?
Exactly, and find a new way to fund it.
That's an interesting take.
Mhm.
All right, let's move on to the next priority. National security. Especially relevant these days.
Couldn't agree more. And the chapter really zeroes in on the risks coming from the Chinese Communist Party, specifically companies like TikTok.
Oh yeah, TikTok has been all over the news lately.
For good reason, law enforcement officials are warning that it could give the Chinese government access to all sorts of user data.
And
Then there's the whole possibility of using the platform to subtly influence what Americans are seeing and believing.
it's kind of scary when you think about it. So what's the solution? Ban TikTok altogether.
Well, the source does recommend a total ban if the current administration's review doesn't lead to some serious changes.
And if it does?
They also want to expand something called the FCC's covered list.
What's that?
Basically, it bans certain companies with ties to China from operating in the U.S. But get this. There are loopholes that allow companies like China Telecom to still offer services, even though they're officially banned.
How do they do that?
They exploit these unregulated channels. It's like playing whack-a-mole.
And the authors want to close those loopholes.
You got it. They also call for a clean standards initiative.
What's that?
It's all about countering China's growing influence in setting technology standards.
Ah, I see.
And believe it or not, they even suggest preventing U.S. companies from providing cloud computing services to China.
Whoa, really? Why?
The concern is it could unintentionally help them develop advanced artificial intelligence.
Okay, so we've got reining in big tech, tackling national security threats. Where does the economy fit into all of this?
That's where unleashing economic prosperity comes in. The argument is that we need a thriving telecom sector to fuel economic growth, and that means the FCC needs to actively promote innovation and competition.
Okay, I'm all for economic prosperity, but how do they suggest making that happen?
One major area is spectrum allocation, basically, deciding who gets to use which parts of the airwaves for things like 5G and Wi-Fi. The book argues that the FCC needs to be more aggressive in freeing up spectrum for commercial use.
So we could see things like,
Faster internet speeds, cool new technologies, and even more jobs.
that's a pretty compelling argument. But what about other government agencies that rely on those airwaves? Wouldn't that lead to conflicts?
You're absolutely right, and they actually use the recent clash between the rollout of 5G and the aviation industry as an example
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
of what can go wrong when there's no coordination. They suggest streamlining the process for resolving these kinds of disputes.
Streamlining is always good.
Yeah.
What else is on the agenda for boosting the economy?
They also talk about modernizing infrastructure rules, especially when it comes to actually getting broadband deployed. Remember how during the Trump administration,
Yeah.
the FCC made it easier to get permits for building cell towers and construction went through the roof? Well, they suggest a similar approach for wired internet infrastructure, making it faster and easier to lay down fiber optic cables.
So basically, less red tape.
Exactly. More internet for everyone.
Right.
And they touch on the need to support low Earth orbit satellite technology.
Like,
Think Starlink, which could be huge for expanding internet access.
especially in those hard-to-reach areas.
Exactly.
So much potential there. But with all this talk about freeing up the market and cutting regulations, doesn't that make accountability even more important? That was the fourth priority, right?
You bet. And they don't hold back on criticizing the current administration's approach to broadband spending, calling it wasteful and poorly coordinated.
Really? How so?
They point out that there are over 100...
Wait, 100?
Yes! Over 100 federal broadband programs spread across 15 different agencies.
Wow.
And there's no clear national strategy, which leads to duplicated efforts and spending money to overbuild networks in places that already have service.
Yikes. Sounds like a recipe for disaster. So what's the fix?
Well, they call for a top-to-bottom review of all those programs
To do what?
to get rid of redundancy and waste. They also want stricter accountability standards.
So we can be sure.
That funding is being used to connect the communities that really need internet access.
Not just lining the pockets of companies who don't. Seems pretty straightforward.
You'd think, right. They also propose a complete overhaul of FCC regulations.
A complete overhaul.
They want to scrap any rules that are outdated or stifling competition.
Which makes sense since...
Technology is changing so rapidly these days. We need a system that can adapt.
that encourages innovation instead of holding it back.
Exactly.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground here. Reining in big tech, boosting national security, promoting economic growth, and ensuring accountability.
That's a pretty ambitious to-do list.
It is.
What jumps out at you as the most important point?
For me, it's how the authors emphasize the why. It's not just about blindly following policies. It's about grasping those underlying goals and principles. They see these 4 priorities as interconnected pieces of a much bigger puzzle.
So it's not just about individual policies. It's about a coherent vision for the future of telecommunications in the U.S.
You got it. I like that. That's what makes this deep dive so interesting. Speaking of intriguing, here's something to ponder as we move on. How might all these advancements in technology, especially those low Earth orbit satellites, change the whole regulatory framework for telecommunications? Could they actually reshape the role of the FCC in the future?
That is a great question.
Right. We'll have to save that for another time. But for now, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of the FCC and its potential future. Stay tuned for more.
Really makes you think about how all this would actually work, you know?
Yeah, like in the real world.
Like that idea about big tech contributing to the Universal Service Fund.
Yeah.
At first, it sounds kind of fair, right? Making sure everyone's chipping in for this essential internet stuff.
Especially since those companies practically live online.
Hmm.
But how would that even work? Would it be like a flat fee for everyone? Or based on how much they use the internet? Or maybe how much money they rake in?
That's a good question. Honestly, the chapter doesn't get into those nitty-gritty details. It would definitely require some serious thought to avoid unintended consequences, you know?
Like what?
Well, you wouldn't want a system that unfairly burdens those smaller companies or startups that are just getting started.
Right, squash an innovation before it even begins.
Exactly. And on the flip side, a flat fee might not really move the needle for the USF, especially with these tech giants being as massive as they are.
Yeah, true. It's all about balance, huh?
Finding that sweet spot. Which brings us back to needing a comprehensive approach. It's not enough to just throw ideas around. You got to think about the impact, aim for a solution that's both fair and actually gets the job done.
Makes sense. Okay, let's shift gears for a second, talk about something that's been hard to miss in the news lately. TikTok. The source doesn't hold back on the potential national security risks there.
It's fascinating how this has become such a political hot potato. You've got these valid concerns about data privacy, the possibility of foreign meddling, but then you also have this platform that's wildly popular, especially with younger folks.
Yeah, any action taken against TikTok is going to cause a stir. Ban it outright. You'll get slapped with lawsuits and accusations of censorship. Let it run wild. Well, those security risks just keep simmering. Feels like a no-win situation.
It's a tough one, no doubt. The chapter suggests that a ban might be necessary if other options, like making them sell to a U.S. company, don't actually fix the problem.
Right.
Any action should be based on solid evidence and a good understanding of the consequences.
Like we're walking a tightrope here.
Between national security, individual freedom, and economic factors.
That's a lot.
And that tension kind of runs through this whole chapter, right?
Yeah.
Striking a balance between these competing priorities. There are trade-offs with every decision. Rarely is there a perfect solution.
Okay, let's stay on national security for another minute. That whole Clean Standards Initiative caught my attention. What exactly does that mean? I didn't quite get it.
It's essentially pushing back against the Chinese Communist Party's growing influence in setting those global technology standards. Those standards are crucial because they basically dictate how different technologies work together. Everything from how our phones connect to the internet to the protocols for online security.
So the worry is that if China controls those standards, they could sneak in backdoors or vulnerabilities for things like espionage.
Exactly. And it's not just about intentional backdoors. Either standards could be written in a way that favors Chinese companies or their technology.
Giving them an edge.
Unfairly, yeah, undermining U.S. competitiveness.
It's like a sneaky kind of economic warfare.
Kinda, yeah. So what this Clean Standards Initiative aims to do is work with allies to promote open and transparent standard-setting processes.
Then make sure.
That they're free from any one country's influence.
Strength in numbers, huh? A level playing field.
You got it. It also means investing in research and development here in the U.S., so we stay ahead of the game. The best defense is a good offense.
Makes sense. Okay, let's move on to something a bit closer to home. Broadband infrastructure. The chapter really pushes for modernizing regulations, streamlining those annoying permitting processes, all to speed up getting broadband out there. I'm guessing this is all about getting more people connected to high-speed internet, right?
Absolutely. Connecting people, enabling the next wave of technologies and services.
Such as?
Telemedicine, remote learning, smart cities, the Internet of Things. All these things need fast, reliable internet.
I hear ya. I've heard plenty of complaints about how slow and expensive it can be to get connected in some areas.
Yeah.
People waiting months, sometimes even years for service.
It's a real problem, especially in those rural areas.
Why is that?
The cost of installing all that infrastructure out in the boonies can be crazy high.
Because?
Low population density, tough terrain. The chapter argues that outdated regulations and bureaucratic roadblocks are a big part of the problem.
Like what kinds of regulations?
We'll take the environmental review process. It can take forever. They suggest streamlining those reviews, especially for projects that have minimal environmental impact.
So finding a middle ground.
Between protecting the environment and getting this essential infrastructure built.
I see your point. What about the role of private companies in all of this? The chapter seems to prefer a hands-off approach, letting them compete and do their thing without too much government interference. But couldn't that lead to monopolies or price gouging, especially in places where there's not much competition?
That's a valid concern, for sure. Regulators need to be on the lookout for that. The argument is that competition is the best way to drive innovation and keep prices in check.
Okay.
But they acknowledge that some level of oversight is needed to make sure no one's taking advantage of the system.
So it's about striking that balance.
Between giving businesses the freedom to innovate and protecting consumers.
Right.
And it's important to remember that this whole telecommunications landscape is constantly shifting. Regulations have to be flexible enough to keep up with the changes.
Speaking of new technologies, the authors mention low Earth orbit satellites as a potential game changer for broadband. I know a little about Starlink and some of the other companies working on this. Can you explain how this tech works and why it's so promising?
So those traditional satellites, they orbit way up there, right?
Yeah.
And that introduces latency, basically the delay between sending a signal and getting a response.
Which makes them,
Not ideal for things like video conferencing or gaming, where you need that instant back and forth.
got it. So these low Earth orbit satellites are closer.
Much closer.
Less lag, faster speeds.
Exactly. And because they're closer, they don't need as much power, which makes them cheaper to run.
Sounds pretty sweet.
Yeah.
I bet there are challenges, though, with launching and managing a whole network of satellites up there.
Oh, for sure. Technical hurdles like launching and maintaining the satellites and regulatory stuff like spectrum allocation and dealing with all that space junk.
Space junk.
Yeah, it's a real problem.
Huh. So not a perfect solution, but it could be a huge step forward.
Especially for those remote or underserved areas.
Makes sense. We've covered a lot here. Big tech, national security, broadband infrastructure, emerging technologies. But before we wrap up, I want to circle back to accountability. The chapter is pretty critical of the current approach to broadband spending,
They say it's riddled with waste and inefficiency.
and they blame the current administration.
Yeah, pointing to a lack of oversight and coordination.
So how do we fix that? How do we make sure our tax dollars are being used effectively, that these programs are delivering?
They suggest a few things. First, a comprehensive review of all those federal broadband programs
To do what?
to get rid of anything redundant and streamline the funding process. And second, stricter accountability standards. Proof that programs are actually connecting people.
Sounds reasonable enough.
You'd think so, but there's always pushback when you try to change how the government does things.
Plus, some people benefit from the status quo, even if it's not working.
Exactly. It takes real leadership to make those changes happen and hold agencies accountable.
Let's wrap up with a final thought here. The source argues that because technology is changing so fast, we need more flexible regulations. But how do we balance that flexibility with consumer protection, making sure the market is fair for everyone? Could too much deregulation backfire?
Great questions. It highlights the challenge for policymakers in this ever-changing landscape. We want to encourage innovation, which often means fewer rules, but we also need to protect consumers and ensure a level playing field for all.
It's that tightrope walk again.
Fostering innovation while protecting the public interest.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see how this all unfolds in the coming years.
It's a balancing act, for sure. And it really highlights that we need to keep talking about this stuff.
Yeah.
Collaboration between policymakers, industry folks, consumer advocates. It's not a one-and-done thing. Gotta keep adapting.
The world keeps spinning. You can't just make policies and assume they'll work forever, especially with tech changing so fast. Got to stay flexible, right?
Exactly. And that brings us back to the FCC's whole purpose, serving the public interest. Whether it's promoting competition, protecting us from threats, or getting everyone connected, it's about making life better for Americans, making sure everyone can be part of this digital world.
Well said.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the FCC, what's the one thing you hope our listeners walk away with?
I hope they have a better grasp of these issues, and how important it is to have smart policies in this area. The FCC's decisions affect us all, from how we talk to each other to how we learn and work. It's crucial to engage with this stuff and speak up.
Absolutely. We can't just sit back and let others decide. We need to be informed, engaged citizens. And that starts with understanding what's at stake.
And that's exactly what we've tried to do here, give you the knowledge to navigate this complex, constantly changing world.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, folks, that's a wrap on this episode. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the world of the FCC. We hope you found it insightful and got you thinking. Keep exploring these topics, keep those conversations going. Until next time, stay curious.